One of the oft-repeated positions of those involved in testing on animals is that it's underpinned almost every medical advance of the last century, and that, upsetting as some find it, there are very seldom any alternatives. But what if those odds could be changed and we could find other ways to get the data we need? It's hard to imagine many researchers would insist on continuing to use animals if reliable alternatives were available. So how much room is there to do things any differently? The Dr. Hadwen Trust is a UK charity devoted to finding and funding ways to supersede animal experiments. And they've just announced the creation of the first Professorial Chair in Animal Replacement Science. With me is the Trust's Science Officer, Alpesh Patel, along with Dominic Wells, Professor of Translational Medicine at the Royal Veterinary College. And Dominic Wells, I think we'd probably start by clarifying what translational medicine means, in case people think you're a linguist.
Translational medicine is moving from the laboratory bench to the clinic and having that view in mind when you do the experiments in the laboratory.
Right, making nice ideas practical.
That's right.
Okay, and Alpesh Patel, now, so what's the role of this new chair that the Dr. Hadwen Trust is funding, and what will this position, when it's filled, the person in this position, be able to do that's not just happening in the natural process of scientific development?
Well, what we're hoping the position will do is act as a bridge between the scientific community, the legislative governmental organisations and the supporters in the street, to make people more aware of what alternatives are to animal experimentation, what their uses are, and where else they can be applied. So the person that's going to fill this position will be doing their own research to develop alternatives, but also act as a focal point so that the rest of the wider world, the wider scientific community, can understand what alternatives are available and where they're useful.
So as far as you're concerned, is it twofold? One is to try and find new alternatives, and secondly is to alert the wider community to existing alternatives that perhaps they're not already aware of?
Yes, very much so. So we have a whole bank of knowledge and material and techniques that have already been developed by scientists that are replacing animal experiments as we speak, but there are also gaps in that knowledge. So what we want to do going forwards is to build on those gaps and say, right, well, can we develop other alternatives that plug these gaps where currently they may not exist?
And does the Trust come at this from the viewpoint that testing on animals is wrong, or more that it's the best way that we've currently got, but we can find better ways that don't involve animals?
Testing on animals is wrong, and historically everyone knows the arguments as to why this has happened, but we live in a modern society. We wouldn't currently now go around on a horse and cart because it's outdated technology, it's outdated systems. We live in a modern world, we all drive cars now. So in the same way,
Which is why we have the pollution problems we were talking about at the beginning of the programme, yes.
Which is why we now have the pollution problems, unfortunately. But in that same way, we now live in the modern world. We have modern techniques, we have modern technologies that are there, or that can be developed, or that can be created to replace the use of animals. So that's where the Dr. Hadwen Trust is coming from, and that's where the Dr. Hadwen Trust is going forwards in the future.
Dominic, do you agree with this idea that testing on animals is somehow antiquated and we just haven't found a way to replace it yet?
No, I don't think I can do that. What I would say is that we have embraced a lot of methods that can replace some aspects of animal experimentation. And for instance, in the pharmaceutical industry, people are doing cell culture models, they're doing computer models to narrow down the list of compounds which then go into animal experiments. Previously, those had used a lot more animals. We also are looking at ways of trying to make the whole drug discovery process very efficient. And so, for instance, microdosing, using human volunteers, getting very, very small doses of drug, is a sensible step in the drug discovery process that minimises the number of animals used and also allows us to make decisions about when to stop a program or when to continue to develop a program.
Because there are a lot of hurdles to go through, there's a lot of difficulties involved, there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of preparation, there's a lot of cost. I don't imagine there would be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth if somebody did, by some miracle, come up with a reason to never have to use an animal in an experiment again.
And yes, absolutely. We're all committed to the idea of reducing, refining, and indeed replacing the use of animals in experiments. But a living organism, an animal, is an immensely complicated thing. And whilst you can look at elements of that immense complication in culture, for instance, it's currently impossible to completely reproduce that complexity. And that applies whether we're thinking about understanding gene function or whether we're thinking about developing new treatments for various diseases.
Every drug is different, but can you take us through a sort of process that's involved in going from an idea to getting something to the market and the stages at which animal testing is likely to be involved?
Absolutely. So you have a concept. You start off with, this is the disease I want to treat, this is the target I'm going to go for, and you can do a lot of those initial identification studies in cells and culture. You need to know whether that target is defined to a particular set of cells, whether it's throughout the body. So you may do some very initial animal experiments at that stage. You then screen for a molecule that's going to hit that target. You do a lot of that screening in cell culture, you do a lot of that screening by computer modeling, and only when you've got your lead candidates do you now go into animals to check those lead candidates are able to do what you predict they're going to do. If they do, then you define the perfect candidate, and you have to then go into an initial safety trial to define what is a therapeutic dose, what is a dose that becomes toxicity limiting. And that helps you to design, for instance, a microdosing study or a safe phase 1 clinical trial.
And Alpesh, I'd imagine that there are some stages of that process that are going to be more amenable to finding alternatives than others.
That is true. And again, one of the hurdles that we face as a scientific community at the moment is legislation. But what the Dr. Hadwen Trust is really focusing on and is trying to push for is not just toxicity testing and drug testing, because when you look at the statistics for animal use, it's a very small number. What we're looking at is we're looking at fundamental biological research, the understanding of what is happening at a disease, and it's those numbers that are increasing and those numbers that are keeping the statistics at a high level. So it's not just at drug testing, and we're not just talking about drug discovery, we're talking about understanding what a disease is, how it's affecting the body, and at that stage what we're saying is the human is the best model for looking at human disease. So human systems, cell culture systems, bioinformatics, computer studies, those sort of things are better and are more applicable to the human condition than looking at these things in an animal. In certain cases, the animals don't get those diseases, or they present different symptoms or different conditions, and that cannot be translated back to the humans.
But as things stand, even if you had the entire population of Milton Keynes eagerly volunteering to have your new drug tested on them, you wouldn't be allowed to do that unless you'd gone through various animal models first.
That is true, and that's something, again, that the Professorial Chair and working into the future that the Dr. Hadwen Trust is going to be tackling is that at a government level, at a legislative level, when we can show that there are alternatives that exist, there are alternatives to nearly all, and for example in drug testing there are alternatives to all the different toxicology tests that need to be done, then we can put, as scientists and as members of the public, we can put pressure on the government to start changing their rules, and then we will come to a stage where we don't have to test on animals.
Dominic, I think the US National Academy of Sciences has argued that even the most advanced computer models are still a very long way from being able to mimic the complexities of interactions between molecules, cells, tissues, organs, organisms and the environment. Within the foreseeable future, do you think we're going to see any significant decline in animal testing?
Frankly, no, because exactly the complexity is too high, and I cannot see at the moment a system that could possibly reproduce that complexity in a way that allows you to allow for unforeseen events, which is what toxicity is often about.
Alpesh?
We're making progress, and so without positions like this Professorial Chair, and without people taking the development of alternatives forwards, we're never going to be able to get to a point where we can say we don't have to use animals. So the point of this chair is that it's developing these techniques.
OK, thank you very much, Professor Dominic Wells, Alpesh Patel.